Welcome to the final video in this chapter around fatigue and recovery, in particular recovery. Now, just a reminder to you that these videos are intended for use before the lesson to give you an introduction into what we will discuss during the lesson, and also just as a memory jogger prior to the SAC upcoming in a few weeks. It's very important that you're still obviously in class, mentally and physically, and making sure that you're paying attention to the discussion, the comments, and the work that's being asked of you to complete in there, because those organic discussions that take place in class are invaluable. I wanted to show you a section of the textbook here, which is the end of the fatigue, chapter 8. Now, we've already discussed what to do for refueling, rehydrating, both in class and in our video tutorials. Now it's all about what to do with the buildup of these metabolic byproducts. And obviously, when you hear metabolic byproduct, one of the first things that's going to come to your mind is lactic acid, in particular the acid, the hydrogen ions. So as you can see here, there are large amounts of hydrogen ions accumulated when the lactate inflection point, or the maximal lactate steady state, which is the steady state that you can keep in at an intensity that's comfortable for your body. So if you have a look over here at the graph that we've all seen 1,000 times before, we always have some lactate in our body. It's never going to be sitting at zero. When we start exercising at different intensities, as the exercise intensity goes across here, it's going up 1, 2, 3, 4, whether that's in METs or heart rate, or however you want to measure how intense the activity is. This is not duration, this is intensity. And as the intensity is going up, our body is able to flush out any of the hydrogen ions that are being built up. However, we will hit that point in which the intensity in which we are exercising is unable to remove the lactic acid that is being created as quickly as it's being removed. That is the lactate threshold. That is your inflection point. And if you can find an intensity level around here, that is your MLSS, the ability for you to sustain that level of intensity for longer periods of time. So, what we know here is that's roughly around about 85% of your maximum heart rate. However, if you've done some aerobic conditioning, meaning that you've conditioned your heart rate and your stroke volume to be able to work at maximal and optimal levels, you can probably push that to about 90% of your max heart rate before you've ended up tipping over that lactate inflection point. So a really good way to build up that aerobic energy system, or reason to build up that aerobic energy system. The reason for this is that the hydrogen ions can be removed from the muscles. It really helps out. Now, one of the things that they recommend for if there is a buildup of hydrogen ions in the muscles is an active recovery. Now, an active recovery is meaning two things here. A reminder from class, it's both a cool down at the end of that exercise session, but it's also an active recovery day on your rest day for a trained athlete. And the reason why it's important is all to do with the valves and the veins inside the body. Let's have a look at this heart working. This heart's pumping, and as the heart's pumping, don't forget we've got red arteries and we've got blue veins. And as the heart pushes, it's pushing the blood out of those red arteries. Now that blue vein there is heading to the lungs to go and pick up more oxygen into blood, but this red stuff here that comes out the back through the aorta, that's the stuff that's going to be circulated down and throughout the body, down to the legs, down to the arms. Now, that's great because as the heart pumps, the blood that flows through those arteries has got both gravity working downwards with it and also the push of the heart that squeezes the blood down through those arteries. So that blood can get all the way down to the calf, etc. very, very simply. However, the problem is that when we're trying to get the blood to move back through the veins, it has to head uphill. It's fighting against gravity. A reminder that veins have valves. They're one-way valves. So as the blood comes up this vein, if it rests back down, the valve will be closed. As it goes up the next section of the vein, it can rest and the blood will close. And we know that the muscles are helping by pushing the vein together and forcing the blood up in that right direction. Now, if an athlete completes a cool down or the active recovery, we're actually giving more of this muscle stimulation and more blood flow through veins. So that means any of those built up hydrogen ions or even the lactate can actually be pushed out of the areas that are affected, like maybe the calf if you've been doing a lot of skipping, for example. And this is called a muscle pump. So the increased blood flow helps in the veins. The other thing that helps is having higher oxygen levels. So if you were to run and then just simply stop or sit or lie down, then you will return back to resting breathing rate and heart rate fairly quickly. However, a cool down or even an active recovery on the day off increases the amount of oxygen while not necessarily increasing the demand on the body. That extra oxygen can help with getting rid of these hydrogen ions. As we know, hydrogen ions and oxygen can become H2O in a process. So if somebody was to stop exercise straight away, they had a lot of hydrogen ions inside their body, they will actually go through what's called venous pooling. Venous meaning veins, pooling meaning sitting still. So the blood will sit in between these valves, and that blood can have a high amount of acid from the hydrogen ions, but also lactate inside it. So that is a really bad thing. So if we work with a muscle pump and we give some light exercise, this is what can happen. If you have a look over here, both athletes finished with the same amount of blood lactate concentration. Lactate, hydrogen ions, lactic acid. One of the athletes stopped and did no exercise, and soon enough, after 40 minutes, the body was able to get from 12 down to roughly about 4 millimoles per litre of lactate in the blood, which is not too bad. However, that athlete did a passive rest. This athlete in the light grey did a light exercise active recovery cool down, and you'll notice that after the same time, 40 minutes, there was half the amount of lactate in the blood. So it shows that that muscle pump and the extra oxygen works when they take blood samples. The other thing that's talked about here is doing other methods of trying to get blood flow working, because the whole idea is vasodilation and vasoconstriction, moving blood through the veins and the arteries. Now, one thing we know is that massage can stimulate blood flow. Hot-cold contrast showers can stimulate blood flow. Each of these items that stimulate blood flow, like even a hot-cold contrast shower, are fantastic in removing this blood pooling, venous pooling, lactate and hydrogen ions around the bloodstream. So a contrast shower of going 3 minutes or so in hot water followed by a minute of cold water for 3 or 4 cycles shocks the body into squeezing all the muscles and pushing the blood out, and then the hot water actually helps speed things up inside the body like blood flow. So a hot cold contrast shower is a good idea, as is a massage. The only problem is that when you do those things like a hot cold contrast shower or a massage or even one of the massage guns that are out these days, is that it's not also eliciting excess oxygen inside the body. And oxygen can really help with speeding up the removal of those hydrogen ions. So the active recovery is one of the best ways to remove that metabolic byproduct. One of the things that I want you to think about when you get down to this final section of other byproducts is that this is quite a confusing section. One of the things that it talks about early on here is about phosphate creatine. Now, there are studies that have shown that in order to replace phosphate with creatine, it works even better when oxygen is present. So that would almost lead us to say that doing an active recovery will help replenish your phosphate creatine stores. However, it goes on to also say that if there's a lot of ADP in the body, meaning that ATP has been used up, which would be an active recovery, then the PC regeneration slows down. And so this is a bit of a contradiction in itself. And as we have also discussed earlier, an passive rest or recovery is best to replenish phosphate creatine and also help with the ADP and P. So that means that if the body has depleted a lot of phosphate creatine during its run, then after a cool down, a passive rest would be best. If the body spent a lot of time in the anaerobic glycolysis system and building up metabolic byproducts, then an active recovery would be best on that next day. The final section here refers to that central nervous system and the ability for the body to not fire its signals and allow for contractions and movements in the muscles. With the sodium, potassium, and all of those electrolytes we've already discussed, it is absolutely advisable that the best advice is rest, and that is passive rest to give the body the best opportunity for the brain to continue to function at its absolute prime. In class, I spoke about the importance of sleep, and this is alluding to the importance of sleep here as well. Hopefully, you're sitting in a position right now where you can see that if an athlete has spent a predominant amount of time in each of those three energy systems, you know what has happened within their body, whether it's depletion of fuels or whether it's a buildup of metabolic byproducts. And whichever one of those it is, hopefully now you know whether you should use a passive or an active recovery. And if you need to replenish things like fluids for hydration, carbohydrates or proteins because of fuels that were used or regeneration of muscle, you should know how much and as soon as possible when to consume those food fuels. Hopefully these videos have helped, and we'll set up some videos going into Unit 4.